The year 1914 saw the outbreak of World War I, a war that would result in the deaths of millions and turn Europe into a hotbed of revolution and social change. The reasons for war breaking out we have covered in previous classes. They are listed here: militarism, alliances, nationalism, imperialism, and assassination of the Archduke Ferdinand. Foreign wars are viewed in America through the lens of isolationism or interventionism. Isolationism is a word for neutrality or non-intervention. It is a term coined, possibly by pro-war factions, and is meant to suggest weakness. Interventionism has been in vogue since the turn of this century, and the invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan are both policies of intervention. George Washington, in his farewell address, warned the United States of the dangers of alliances and involvement in foreign wars, and stressed that America should remain neutral. In 1914, Woodrow Wilson, a Democrat, had been elected President of the United States. On the outbreak of war, he stressed neutrality. Among America's population was a large contingent that would support the Central Powers. The Irish Americans harbored long ill will towards the English, and indeed would have a rebellion in 1916 that would ultimately lead to their independence. German Americans made up the largest immigrant group, so support for American involvement, particularly on the American side, was not a given. The predominant feeling at the time was that the United States should remain neutral. Two camps, one of preparedness and one of pacifism, did arise in the United States. The latter was the predominant feeling of the day, that is, pacifism, and Henry Ford, the car magnate, even set sail in 1915 in a peace ship, the Ushg II. From the beginning, though, the American media portrayed the Germans as the villains. Yellow journalism continued the myth of German villainy that would continue through the 1920s and 1930s. In August 1914, Wilson, following the war's outbreak, gave an indication of his stance on the war when he said, "Every man who loves America will act and speak in the true spirit of neutrality and friendliness to all." By 1916, he was campaigning on the slogan, "He kept us out of the war." His Secretary of State, William Jennings Bryan, likewise was a champion of neutrality. On land, World War I was one of trench warfare. At sea, Great Britain, being the dominant sea power, undertook a naval blockade of Germany in an attempt to starve it into submission. In response to this blockade, the Germans undertook submarine warfare and claimed its most famous casualty in May 1915 with the sinking of the Lusitania off the south coast of Ireland. Among the victims were American citizens, which caused some outrage in the United States. Germany had warned Americans in newspapers ads not to sail on the ship as it was carrying munitions. The British government for years denied this, but finally admitted in 2014 that yes, the ship had been carrying supplies for the war effort. After the sinking of the Arabic and the Sussex, and under pressure from Wilson, the Germans called off unrestricted submarine warfare. This was known as the Sussex Pledge. Having spent the first 6 slides of this lecture explaining why the United States wanted to stay out of the war, now we will examine why they entered the war. As per usual, monetary considerations were at the forefront. Pre-war years saw the United States in a recession that was ended when war broke out. Naturally then, entry into the war increased economic activity and could only benefit if America entered the war. Secondly, although congressional legislation forbade loaning money to belligerents, banks and other financial institutions got around this by extending credits to the Allied or Entente nations. Naturally then, it was in their interest that France and England win the war. The Zimmermann Note is another historical reason for United States entry into World War I. The British intercepted a coded message from the German Foreign Minister, Arthur Zimmermann, to the German minister in Mexico, promising Mexico territory they had lost in the Mexican War should they ally themselves with Germany. Of course, we now know that Britain probably altered the telegram to gain public support in America. The Balfour Declaration, passed 7 months after the United States' entry into the war, but dating back to 1916, saw the British offer Jewish Zionists their own homeland if they could get America to enter the war against Germany. Jewish advisors to Wilson pushed for entry, and the media ramped up anti-German propaganda. Faced with increasing American hostility and suffering under the British blockade, the Germans had no choice but to return to unrestricted submarine warfare. This brought America into the war. Having done a U-turn on his election promise, Wilson couched American declaration of war in moral terms. America shall come into the full light of day when we all shall know that she puts human rights above all other rights, and that her flag is the flag not only of America but of humanity. On April 6, 1917, the United States declared war on Germany, and the nation sprang into action. The Selective Service Act had men between the ages of 21 to 30 register for military service. In 1918, it was increased to 18 to 45. In 1918, the totally registered number was 24 million. The War Industries Board was formed to coordinate the manufacture and purchase of all supplies needed in the war effort. Lastly, the Fuel Administration increased production of fuels and reduced consumption by the domestic users. As is usual with wars, the economy prospered. Corporate profits and wages rose. Farmers too benefited from increased demand. The factories in the northern cities needed to fill their jobs and looked to blacks and Hispanics. More than 500,000 blacks moved north from the south to take employment in the factories. Volunteer organizations like the Red Cross and the Knights of Columbus sent groups to serve in Europe as part of the war effort. To preserve security during the war, Congress passed legislation that curtailed the civil liberties or freedom of the people. The Espionage Act of 1917 provided heavy fines and up to 20 years in prison for anyone who refused to sign up for the army, interfered with the draft, and otherwise aided the enemy. The Sedition Act of 1918 further extended the Espionage Act to writing or saying anything negative about the Constitution. It was so broad that even the leader of the Socialist Party, Eugene V. Debs, who had previously run for president, was jailed. He was later pardoned. In all, about 1,500 people were sent to jail, and 450 conscientious objectors were also imprisoned. The constitutionality of the Espionage Act was upheld in the court case Schenck versus United States. Charles Schenck, a socialist, was arrested for handing out leaflets discouraging men from signing up. He was arrested and jailed, but appealed the decision on First Amendment grounds. In 1919, his case was heard by the Supreme Court, who unanimously ruled against him and upheld the Espionage Act. The decision, authored by Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, said that Schenck's actions presented a clear and present danger, and that Congress exercised appropriate authority. He compared handing out the leaflets to shouting fire in a crowded theatre, which would cause panic and harm to people. Today, the Patriot Act, passed after 9/11, allows the government to spy on people and likewise limits our civil liberties. Throughout the war, anti-German propaganda was prevalent, and German culture particularly came under attack. German composers like Bach, Beethoven and Brahms were no longer heard in concerts. Paintings were removed from museums, and sauerkraut was renamed Liberty Cabbage. It's to be noted that when France refused to support the invasion of Iraq in 2003, Congress passed a resolution changing French fries to freedom fries. The vilification of Germany would be returned to with the advent of fascism in the 1930s. American involvement in the war turned the tide in the Entente powers' favour. Russia had exited the war following the 1917 revolution, but the last German offensive could not overcome the addition of American forces on the Western Front. American casualties compared to those of the other nations were small, and indeed half of the 117,000 deaths were the result of the 1918 flu epidemic. The password today is peace. He gave one of the first international radio broadcasts in support of his 14 points, and his point on self-determination, where countries made their own decisions, particularly appealed to those who were part of empires. However, in America, opposition to his 14 points was growing. The Republicans, seeing a chance to make political gains, called it soft, and in 1918 they captured the Senate, thus ensuring ratification of a final treaty would be difficult. His desire to keep negotiations secret upset the press, who also began to take an anti-treaty stance. In December 1919, the countries involved in World War I arrived in Paris for the peace conference. It is important to note that one of the reasons the Germans came to this peace table was Wilson's 14 points and his peace without victory principle. However, Britain and France, two of the big four of the United States, Great Britain, France and Italy, came bent on revenge, and the final Treaty of Versailles would allow the seeds of World War II to be sown. The main points of the Treaty of Versailles need not concern us here, except for proposed US membership of the General Assembly of Nations, which would become the League of Nations. It was this point that Wilson felt strongest about, a peacekeeping organisation where nations could meet to iron out their differences and avoid war. However, most Americans opposed membership of the League, fearing further entanglement in European affairs and involvement in wars over which they had no control. The spirit of George Washington was alive with the people in 1919. In Congress, two factions emerged: the reservationists, led by Henry Cabot Lodge, who proposed changing parts of the treaty, and the irreconcilables, who flat out opposed membership because it would take away Congress's power to declare war. Wilson took his case to the people, touring the country and making over 40 speeches. However, he was fighting an uphill battle. In October 1919, he suffered a stroke that left him weak and partially paralysed. His days of leading the country were done. The debate over the Treaty of Versailles continued, and the first vote was taken in November 1919. It was a defeat for the treaty, and again in March 1920 it suffered another defeat when the next vote was taken. So the United States would not be a signatory to the Treaty of Versailles. A separate treaty between Germany and the United States would be signed in 1921. But the fact that the United States would not be a member of the League of Nations doomed it to failure. Going forward through the 1920s and 1930s, the United States returned to a policy of isolationism. Please do the following questions in the assigned place, either on Nearpod or in Google Forms. Thank you. Pause the slide if you need more time to answer the questions. I will allot 15 seconds to each slide. That completes our lecture for today. Thank you for your time and attention.